What you always wanted to ask. In this series, we focus on the Christian predicament today. Here D.R.VALSON deals with the many perplexing questions that thinking Christians, especially the youth, harbor but do not ask for want of appropriate help or opportunity. Addressing these questions is essential to be clearer about our life of faith. As one who has participated in the intellectual and spiritual formation of young people over 2 generations, D.R.VALSON is in a vantage point to address such questions. The viewers are welcome to raise their questions and concerns pertaining to the insights offered in this series so that they may be addressed as well. So, welcome to this series titled What You Always Wanted to Ask, as supplementary to the series What Jesus Meant.
Good morning and welcome to all of you. In today's series, Seeds of Thought, we focus our attention to the idea of tithe. Many people have asked me regarding the origin of the practice of tithe, its meaning, its scope, its maintainability, so on and so forth. So I thought it would be worthwhile to attain some clarity on this practice. To the extent I can recollect, or to the extent that I know, the earliest reference to tithe is in the 28th verse of the book of Genesis, verses 20 to 22. It's appropriate to read that text, and it's very interesting to reflect on it. It reads as follows, and this is what Jacob does. Then Jacob made a vow before God, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I'll give you a full tenth. Now, it's very interesting to look at the broad features of what Jacob is saying. The first thing to note is that Jacob is clearly striking a bargain with God. That's very important to recognize this. So Jacob is entering into a contract. In a contract, the 2 sides that participate in forming a contract have their corresponding obligations. So here is God on the one side, Jacob on the other. They're entering into a contract. God has certain duties assigned by Jacob. It's important for us to remember this. There should be clarity on these issues. God is a passive object here. Jacob assigns to God certain responsibilities. And what are those responsibilities? You must maintain me as I am. You must go with me wherever I go. In other words, you must be part of all that I want to do, whether you like it or not. And finally, you must maintain me in my basic needs. There must be food to eat, there must be clothes to wear, there must be shelter, etc. So clear obligations are imposed on God by Jacob, and in return, he offers a certain he accepts a certain obligation, again set by himself. God has nothing to do with it. This is done unilaterally, quite arbitrarily. And Jacob says, if you behave according to this pattern, if you are good to me, then I will give you, it's interesting, I will give you a tenth of all that you give me. It's a very interesting deal, isn't it? I will give you a tenth of all that you give me. If you say this to a kindergarten child, the child would tell you, in that case, wouldn't it be better for God to keep all the 100% to himself? Why should God give 100% to Jacob? So that out of the 100% he gives to Jacob, Jacob may give 10% to God. It's an absurd deal. So, in its very origin, this is the context, this is the idea, and therefore Two things you must notice in particular. First, this is a contractual phenomenon. Man unilaterally is dragging God into a contract. And in this contract, again unilaterally, man in the form of Jacob imposes certain responsibilities and restrictions on God. In other words, God is sought to be bound to abide by certain conditions laid down by man. It's important for us to know. In this idea, there's absolutely no notion of man seeking and understanding God's will in order to abide by it. Jacob unilaterally creates these conditions without any consideration whatsoever as to whether or not this is pleasing to God. And then he determines his side of the contract also. Namely, out of all the things that you give me, I'll give you 10% back. So this is extremely important. Now, therefore, you find, predictably, you find absolutely no reference or no prescription on the part of Jesus. Jesus does not prescribe the giving of the tithe as a spiritual obligation. Absolutely not. Read the 4 Gospels, you will see this. Why? For the good reason that Jesus does not envisage a contractual relationship between God and human beings. This is a fundamentally unchristian idea. Unchristian in the sense of a Christianity that stays faithful to the teachings of Jesus Christ. If you ask me whether such a Christianity exists today or not, I'll have to scratch my head and say, well, I don't know. But this is very clear. Jesus does not lay down the adherence to this Old Testament practice as an essential spiritual duty. And I have already suggested the reason for it. Jesus came to break the contractual relationship in order to place instead, in its place, a covenantal relationship. A covenantal relationship is not juridical, or it's not bound by law, it is guided by love. So when Jesus effects a shift from the foundation of law to the new foundation of love, this idea of man tying God down to a contractual obligation becomes completely redundant. It cannot be maintained at all. All right, then you will ask me, doesn't the church need money? Shouldn't workers, God's workers, so-called, be maintained? Of course they should be maintained. Of course the church needs money. Priests have to be paid, church buildings have to be maintained, there are all kinds of expenses, and of course the luxurious living of bishops has to be sustained, which is an increasingly unbearable burden. All that I accept. But there is only one point I want you to reflect. I don't want to make this a long discussion. I suggest just one thought to you. Pay some attention to this. Here, what Jacob is saying, of all that you give me, I will give you 10%, tithe. Let me ask you, if you say of all that you give me, would you also not include the wisdom God has given to you, the organizational abilities God has given to you, the leadership qualities God has given to you, the spiritual sensitivities God has given to you? And if you then go and tell your priest, well, take 10% of this also. Give me the opportunity within the church to exercise my leadership qualities, my administrative abilities, my wisdom, my insight, my scholarship, my understanding. Take 10% of it and utilize in the life of the church. The priest will become extremely upset. But there is something that will upset the priest even more, and that is, you tell the priest, well, the condition is that 10% of all that God has given to me. Well, let me tell you that God has given me a lot of suffering. I go through a lot of struggle, a lot of privation, a lot of agony in my life. Will the church take 10% of it and use it? In all likelihood, the priest will faint. So it's interesting. First of all, the idea of tithe in its origin was a contractual idea. Jesus abolished the contractual relationship between human beings and God, and instead redefined our relationship with God as a relationship between father and children, taught us to pray, Our Father in heaven. So this contractual model of relationship is completely rejected. Then come to the next step. The idea that 10% of all that God has given. God gives us not only prosperity, God gives us not only money, God gives us a wide range of experiences, God gives us tremendous other resources, God also gives us trials and tribulations in order to purify us, in order to stimulate us into further growth, in order to make us purified gold. Does the church life have any use for any of these things? No. So therefore, we must understand that this idea of tithe has been very deliberately, cunningly modified in two ways. One, to make it a divine obligation applicable to Christians, which simply is not, absolutely not. Secondly, it has also been modified with respect to its contents. If you go by the biblical statement, 10% of all that God gives, and also believe what the Bible says, that nothing happens to us without God knowing it, which means that God allows these things deliberately and with a purpose. After all, Jesus said, not even a hair from your head will fall without your Father in heaven knowing it. If you accept that teaching, then you have to come to the conclusion that every aspect of our experience, particularly suffering, tribulation, privation, etc., all these are also God's gifts. That's why Jesus says, blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil falsely against you. Rejoice, for great is your reward in heaven. So all this is part of God's plan. Will the church take 10% of it? No. So the idea of God's gift has been reduced in a very cynical, diabolic fashion to money. That is where this idea of the tithe needs to be criticized. I'm not against giving. In fact, I feel giving is an expression of freedom. But giving converted into a form of holy extortion under the pretext of tithe, overlooking its origin, overlooking the fact that Jesus completely transcended the legal foundation of it, overlooking also the fact that the priestly class has horribly reinvented it in order to suit their mercenary, covetous interest, and reduced its scope only to money, which is totally opposed to the spirit of the teachings of Jesus Christ and biblical spirituality. This is the truth about the tithe, and I commend it to your thinking, and I thank you for your patient listening. Have a great day.